Welcome to the Aikido Journal podcast. This is your host, Josh Gold, and today we're here with George Ledyard Sensei. George has been practicing Aikido for over 40 years, and he holds the rank of 7th Dan under Mitsugi Saotome Sensei, and he is Chief Instructor of Aikido Eastside in the Seattle area. Welcome to the show, George.
Oh, thank you.
So our primary discussion topics today are going to be centered around the role of uke or ukemi in Aikido practice, and also about skill transmission within the art or problems with skill transmission within the art. I was hoping you could spend just a couple minutes and share a bit about your background, your martial arts background first.
Okay. Well, I got started in college. I trained with a Shotokan karate teacher that was going all over New England. And he was trying to get Shotokan set up as an intercollegiate sport. And I was just lucky enough to be there when he was journeying up to New Hampshire from Boston a couple times a week. So I started with him, and I found out he's still active. Tabata Kazumi Sensei is still active in Boston and has a group of colleges. And I was very interested. He's got to be fairly old now, but that was where I started. And when I got out of college, I went to DC, and I basically, because of a friend, stumbled onto Aikido and Saotome Sensei. Literally was just out walking and saw a sign for a demo and went to see it. And I've been doing it ever since.
Wow.
So, Aikido's been the number one focus for me, but I've done a bunch of cross training. And I think the most influential of it, even though it was fairly brief, was really training with Alexander Sensei, doing some Koryu. We did a bit of Arakiryu and the Todaha Bukoryu Naginata. And it really, I only did it for a couple years with him, seriously. And I never got very far into it. It's so deep. But what did change was the approach of Koryu and the way they trained, how kata training worked, what the whole attitude of training really affected how I look at Aikido. And especially when I do Aikido weapons work, I try and do it as if I was doing the kata and Koryu, and that really helped me out. I did a bunch of police defensive tactics training, and for a while I was doing regular training for law enforcement. I trained with Bookman Sensei in Iaido as well as Aikido. I did a lot of different things. And, the Aiki Expo has really put me in touch with some teachers like Toby Threadgill Sensei and Chuck Clark Sensei and Ushiro Kenji, the karate teacher from Japan. And these people really also changed my whole look of Aikido, my lookout completely. So there have been a lot of stages to this, my practice.
Fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about your thinking on the role of the uke in Aikido.
Okay, my feeling is that somehow or another, the role of uke got bifurcated, and my thinking on it has been affected by two things. I did a fair amount of dabbling in Systema for a while, the Russian martial art, and their methodology for teaching made more sense than a lot of the way the Aikido people tend to try and do things. I think the single most important thing I came away from with the Systema guys was that they don't want to train to do anything that they don't want in the final product. So if your goal is to have a relaxed mind and a relaxed body and to be using Aiki, you should not be training and doing thousands of repetitions in something that doesn't produce that. Too much tension, too much fear, too much pain. It's all of it is counterproductive to the end result. And that got me thinking about the role of uke, because what Aikido seems to have evolved into this very bizarre art where Nage is trying to do this very sophisticated, relaxed Aiki with a partner who sort of acts like a martial arts handicap person. One, they don't act like good martial artists, and two, they for a lot of Aikido people, the idea that they're going to try and do good martial training means the uke is resistant. The uke is using his body completely differently than nage, and that's while the goal is to be able to do that someday at some point in your training, is to be able to handle somebody regardless of whether they're resistant or not. It's a really bad way to train. I mean, it's very much like if you went to learn how to drive and the instructor told you to put the car in gear, and then every time you tried to drive, the instructor hit the brake. You don't learn to do something by not doing it. So I've done a few years now of Daitoryu training under Howard Popkin Sensei and Joe Brogna Sensei. And we have a study group at my dojo that is actually run by some of my students. They're actually more involved with it than I am. But I've done enough now that the methodology really struck me. The percentage of static connection work that's designed to program your body, mind, to have the proper habits, the percentage of that at the beginning of the training is much, much, much higher than what we do. We jump right into the deep end, essentially, with training. The way I trained, I walked into Saotome Sensei's dojo back in 1977, and these people were out on the mat, mostly black belts who had moved to DC to help him open that dojo. And so they're out there training, and one of them got off the mat and talked to me, and I said, I want to do this. So they got me a gi, and they showed me how to tie it, and they put me on the mat. And the very first technique I ever did, I absolutely bowed in and then partnered up, and I was doing Yoku Minushi Shiho Nage, the Ura version. It's like throwing the baby into the pool to see if he can swim. Now, I loved it. And, I put up with the bruising and the bashing, and, there was no beginner class. Sensei was just teaching the black belts. And if you jumped in and could keep up, that was great. But I have come to think that over time, for most people, that's one, inappropriate because they're not going to do it. And two, it's not the shortest way to get the skills. We spent a lot of time doing things that we shouldn't be doing, and realizing that we weren't doing what Saotome Sensei was doing, but really not having a way to access it. And I have to say that the Daitoryu people are better at getting those skills up front, which is one of the reasons I think why all of the 1930s Aikido senseis are sort of legendary figures. They trained differently than the post-war people did. So in our Aikido, in my teaching, I'm trying to put a lot of that, say, static connection work back in. And I also am emphasizing this role of uke. Uke should not be doing anything different than nage. 50% of your training in your Aikido practice is in one role or the other. If you are doing different things in different roles, then your body and your mind just get confused. You're not imprinting the same thing over and over again. You're switching back and forth, and that does not develop the proper habits. So, all of these things that we do, if somebody grabs us and we learn how to join with it and redirect the movement, every single thing we do as nage you should be able to do that as uke. So katata tori is not about grabbing somebody and keeping them from moving. That's idiotic. No one ever won a fight in his life by keeping somebody else from moving. you have to be able to do something. Katatsutori, you should be able to grab someone and get kazushi. It's a, you're supposed to be grabbing them, breaking their balance, and setting up a strike. And the strike is actually the real attack, not the grab. So we're training in a very remedial way, and people have actually forgotten about what these attacks really were. There's no such thing as just a shoulder grab where you grab someone's shoulder and stand there. And certainly not one where you grab somebody and then try and make yourself difficult to move. They just hit you. So, that needs to be fixed because we're not getting the level of skill. We're not getting the bang for the buck for the hours put in on the mat. And what we end up with is people with 20, 30 years in who are athletic. They're in very good shape aerobically, and everything's based on, muscle power, hip power applied against the other person's weak lines. And that might work to a certain extent, but it's not Aiki. And, when you touch somebody who's got real Aiki, it's just a different proposition. Certainly Saotome Sensei has mystified me over the years because even when I'm in shape, I'm 2.5 times his body mass, and I would grab him just absolutely as hard as I could, and he handled me effortlessly. And I for a long time I thought, okay, he's Japanese, and he trained with those sensei, and he's special, and the rest of us can't really do this. But then I met Ange Sensei, and I have to say it was an eye opener for me because Ange Sensei would drop me on the floor and I never felt anything. No force applied. I simply found myself on the floor. And for me, that was when I finally realized that non-Japanese, like white guys, could do this stuff. Before that, I don't think I truly believed it. All the top guys, all the really top people were Japanese when I started, and they seemed special. But Ange was this, kind of older guy with a little Buddha belly, and I was twice his size, and he would invite me to grab him and put him in a bear hug and everything else. And the next thing I knew, I was under control, and I did not feel any force that acted on me. I just moved. And that was a revelation. And, it was the first time I felt somebody that felt like Saotome Sensei, that it was that level of skill. And so I've been after that ever since. And, part of going after that is we have to change how we train. And Uke is a big part of that. The Uke's job is not to fall down, because that's the other problem, is that in a lot of places, Uke is not being resistant, Uke is tanking. They run around, and whatever the nage does, the Uke just goes with it and falls down. And that may be a very nice, blending, moving meditation, certainly aerobic exercise, but it is not ever going to result in any kind of martial skill. In a martial art, you are able to apply your skills against someone who isn't cooperating, falling down, or, being struck, or whatever the technique is that you're doing. The ukemi that the enemy or the opponent takes is not voluntary. They would like to counter you. And if you are serious about doing this art as a martial art, then you really have to not be training with people who are falling. You have to really trust that your partners are not tanking. So,
Yes.
that it's so difficult for people to really get this, because what is in between being overly cooperative and tanking, and then the flip side, which is resisting. And what's in between is Aiki. That if the uke is trying to use the same set of skills that nage is, which is the way we should be training, so that 100% of the time you're on the mat, you're trying to reinforce the same skills, that you're using your structure I developing Aiki is about developing an integrated structure. You're using your intent, the action of your mind on your connective tissues, your ligaments, tendons, and fascia. And one of my internal power teachers, Dan Harden, basically said that your power is directly related to how much tissue you can recruit for your movement. So, when internal power guys talk about this stuff, they say one thing moves, everything moves. There's nothing, an arm is never moving separately from your foot. Everything is connected. And so an uke should be developing that kind of integrated structure. And so when he comes into attack, even if you're, not going to try and break the guy's balance and strike him, but you're actually going to give him a static grab for training purposes, you're doing this not with the intention of stopping him or anything else. You're doing it with the intention of connecting to his center with your structure. And when he attempts to do his movement, if he runs into that structure, you shouldn't be falling down. He should get immediate feedback that, oh, I'm running into that structure. And if he does get the technique properly, then you take the ukemi. You're not there to switch up on him, to mess him up. Not at the beginning anyway. And Toby Threadgill Sensei, who's another Aikijutsu swordsman teacher that I hugely respect, he was saying that he didn't think a student should train with anybody trying to be resistant for at least 5 years. So you have to spend a lot of years imprinting these skills. And if you are striving for success with someone who's competing with you too early in your training, you're going to fall back on muscle power and you'll never get to a high level of skills. You'll just get strong physically. And, for me, I want an Aikido that I'm going to be better at when I'm 90. If you read about Sagawa, who was a contemporary of O-sensei, a student of Takeda Sokaku, Sagawa said, I didn't really start getting good till after my stroke at 80. And, that's Aiki. There's no limit to how good you can get if you're pursuing things on that basis. If you are pursuing things on the basis of athleticism, strength, power, muscle power, speed, that's a young man's game. And it's, it's great. It's very fulfilling if you're in your 20s, and it's wonderful. And certainly how I trained when I was in my 20s. But I think I spent a lot of time and effort training really hard, but not very smart. And I have to spend the last half of my career kind of undoing some of those bad habits that I developed. Too much mental tension, too much physical tension. And I think there are better ways to train. So that's what I'm working on. And it's very hard to get through to people on what that actually means. It's people confuse resistance with being a good attacker. And that's really a mistake. And, most people don't want to go to the dojo and have their stuff not work over and over again. So most dojos, typically everybody just ends up being cooperative, and everybody has a nice practice and everybody falls down and they get a win, and that's great. But it can lead to people spending decades in the art. And I go around and teach, and I hit places, and there are people who are pretty high ranked, and I grab them, and they run into the wall and they look shocked. I'm not even working at stopping them. I'm just giving them decent structure. And it's quite clear that, if you've been training for 25 or 30 years and you get surprised when your skills aren't working like that, it means that you've been training with people who've been falling down for you, that you have not been getting the proper feedback.
Right.
The uke's role is to give you feedback about what you're doing. And initially, I think it's really important to have a high percentage of your training working on, basically static connection exercises. And then the rest of it is as you develop that grounded, integrated structure, where if somebody pushes on you, you don't just fall over, that you really, really do have a good ground connection and a very integrated structure. As you develop that platform, as I call it, that platform is movable. And so as you start to use your Aikido footwork and use your footwork for positioning, wherever you are, you still integrate it. You can take that platform and move it around freely in any direction, and you don't lose it. So, the next step is to really focus on your entries. The uke comes in and gives you tries to give you a good structured connection, and you use your movement to, basically not allow him to really get that connection to your center. But at the end of every entry, you should have kazushi. And, that's the goal of Aikido, was always kazushi on contact. That's Aiki. The moment we touch, you break. And, in the larger, when you start talking about trying to connect technique to the larger philosophical, there's something, Masagatsu, Agatsu, Katsu, Hayabi. Now, if you get into Shinto, which O-sensei was his kind of frame of reference, that's actually a Shinto deity. And a lot of people have heard of portions of that broken down. Masakatsu Agatsu translates as, victory over yourself is the real victory. Katsu Hayabi gets translated sometimes as instant victory. That all of this combines to the idea that the encounter is over in the instant we touch. And that initially, that's physical. In other words, when we touch physically, it's over. Eventually, and this is something that I'm just starting to play with in my own practice, but eventually at the higher level, that touch is more mental, and the encounter is over before we physically touch. And that, O-sensei said it was over before the guy even starts his attack. And I'm beginning to have glimpses of what that means, but I think that'll be my project for the rest of my Aikido career, is to start understanding that. But for most people, it's just let's work on the whole idea that the moment that uke touches you, his balance breaks. You have kazushi. It's the setup for everything martial. And to understand, when it's right, it is effortless, and you don't feel like you're working. And certainly the uke does not feel like he's being really acted on. He just breaks. And so when what you're shooting for is that subtle, you have to absolutely trust that your partners aren't tanking for you, because you won't know the difference. You won't know what you know if your partners are not being honest in their ukemi. So with my own students, it's very easy for a teacher, their students fall into the habit of expecting their teacher's stuff to work. And so pretty soon they're just coming in and starting to take the ukemi, and because they never actually really believed they were going to be able to get you. And so to keep my own ukes honest with my students, I periodically purposely do the technique wrong. I will push or I will tense something up. And if they're already taking the ukemi, I yell at them. It's like, no, 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 you can't do that. I blew that and you should have felt it.
Hmm.
You have to keep insisting that your ukes stay on the program and be present and not be anticipating what's going on, because anticipation is bad for a number of reasons. That Aikido practice is really, from the standpoint that it's a moving meditation, is about being completely in the present instant, just as a Zen meditation would be, only with a lot of movement. And uke and nage should both be. From a safety standpoint, most of the injuries that I ever had taking ukemi came from the fact that I was not in the present instant, that I had thought one thing was happening and it turned out I was wrong, that sensei or my partner was moving differently than I had anticipated. And, that was the problem, is I was anticipating. You have to be in the present instant so that you respond properly to whatever is happening in that instant. And then later on, in your practice, that begins to be how you can apply your henkawaza, your oyawaza, your adjustments, as nage say. If your partner changes something about how he's attacking, in an instant, your technique should change, because you're reflecting back. You're in that balanced state, and you absolutely depend on your uke to be a good partner for years and years and years, to be that good partner so that you develop these proper habits. Does that make sense?
It does, Sensei. And so, speaking of henkawaza, let's maybe look at this just through a really practical lens. And let's say that I've been doing Aikido for a while, and maybe I'm practicing with with a white belt, or maybe I'm practicing with a shodan or something like that. So what would be just some practical examples of how I should be behaving as uke when I'm interacting with people at different levels, and incorporating in henkawaza, or these various things you've been talking about?
Right. This is also very difficult areas, is how to adjust your training so that you're still using the proper skills and your partner's getting the proper learning experience, but you obviously have to adjust for different levels. I'm a seventh dan, and I'm still close to 300 pounds, and if I grab somebody who's more junior and I don't want them to move, clearly I can do that. I can grab somebody's wrist and make them feel like they can't move. And so, yeah, shutting people down isn't appropriate. So, the way I deal with things is, with my partner, I'll grab them and I'll give them a really good structure. And if they succeed, fine, I take the ukemi. But very often, if I give them the kind of structure that I'm capable of using, very often they hit the wall and bam, they feel they can't move. As far as I'm concerned, that was the feedback they needed. They now have felt that they had a problem. So now I have to tone it down. So I start essentially subtracting out structure. I stop using my intent quite so strongly to connect those pieces. And so I start to tone it down, and I find the place where they can succeed. That might require some verbal. And, this is another area where Aikido practice very often differs. In the internal power practice and the Daitoryu that we've got, the partner's allowed to tell you what they feel. So if uke grabs me and I start doing something, I have a student who's, maybe a nidan, but she's giving me feedback about what she feels. She says, you're pushing there, your shoulders are too tight, drop your shoulders. um, that verbal feedback back and forth is extremely helpful, because sometimes you've got problems and you don't know. So this whole thing of shut up and train is, there are some advantages to that, but there are a lot of disadvantages. And it means that, you spend a lot of time spinning your wheels. It's if now this is not the mansplaining that guys do with women. This is not that at all. You have to have partners who are training seriously, and their only interest, they have to be clean about this. Their only interest is in having you succeed on the technique. So, I have a student, Tro Ota, and she's actually, pretty much senior to me in the Daitoryu, even though she's my student in Aikido. And, she's got really good structure. She understands what's going on. So there's no seniority in this practice. When she grabs me, and if I'm screwing up, she doesn't go. And then she tells me what she feels, and I correct it. And then when I correct it, she takes the ukemi. That leads to a very fast learning curve compared to the way I trained, where, Sensei did a technique, didn't explain it much at all. He was willing to show you over and over again, but he really didn't do verbal. And so then you immediately got out there with a partner who thought that it was his job to not let you do the technique, and you were going to magically figure out how to do it. That's really a stupid way to train, frankly. It's you spend decades trying to force stuff, and it doesn't develop the, I had 25 years in, and I knew I wasn't approaching what Sensei was doing. And there are just better ways to do this. And there are other arts in which I think the Aikijutsu arts handle this better in general than the Aikido people do. So I've just introduced different training methodology into the Aikido. I keep the form of Aikido. What I do is recognizable as traditional Aikido, but the way we train is a bit different. And so that when we're doing static technique, that verbal interchange between the two partners is permissible as long as one of them isn't running it as an ego trip on the other one. That's not permissible, and I will shut that off if I see it happening. But I have really nice students, and they really don't do that with each other. When you get feedback from somebody, they're very sincere about it, and pretty typically they're right when they tell you, regardless of what your Dan rank is, they tell you your shoulder's tight and it's up, you better be looking at your shoulder. That's a really good way to train. And everybody gets really involved in the training. And it also gets you past all the traps of this hierarchical nonsense that we can get caught in Aikido, where, people think they're a big deal just because they've got a big Dan rank, and, they don't have a clue what they're doing, but they're important. That we can get past that real fast when you train this way. And, I think it's a much better way.
Yes, I agree. I think that's it can be a somewhat dysfunctional element of the Aikido culture, is getting too into this hierarchy. I remember I was at a seminar a few months ago, and he was with a sensei who has a style it's a little bit different than mine. And so after one of the sessions on the mat, somebody came up to me and they said, I noticed this person was correcting you, and they're your kohai, right? They're ranked lower than you. And what did you think of that? And I said, well, I actually solicited that feedback, and I want that feedback because this person has more expertise in this particular style than me, and they have valid feedback, right? And so I can learn from that regardless of any rank differential. And even my own dojo, I'll ask people all the time, even white belts, how does this feel? Am I able to break your balance properly? And we can learn from that, I think.
Yeah, it really needs to be voluntary, and it needs to be part of the culture in the dojo. The teacher needs to make sure that no one's running ego trips on it.
Yes.
It also is something that the teacher himself needs to model for people, that, when we're training and especially when we're doing the connection work. That's really where it's important. We don't really talk much when we're doing movement training. If we're doing real waza, uh, that kind of feedback might be appropriate, but it's more like the partner asks for it. The nage will ask, okay, how come I'm having trouble here? But the when we're doing static practice, that feedback is kind of assumed that we're all helping each other. And anytime somebody runs into problems, the partner helps them overcome it. So when I'm training with junior people, that's exactly how I do it. I I give them a good attack to start with. If they run into problems, then I immediately give them some tips about what they could do to solve the problem. And I also make an appropriate adjustment to how much structure I'm giving them. And hopefully they got the feedback about what they could do. And, typically most people, if I give them some clear body centered feedback, they will make that correction. And on the next one, they'll succeed. And so we'll do a few repetitions where I kind of stay at that lower level of structure until they seem like they're really getting it. And then I'll start to up it again. Then I start giving them a little more structure, and we go until they run into problems again. And then at that point, we have to talk about why they're running into problems. And once again, what do you need to do with your intent or your body or whatever to not be running into the problem at that point? So this is very much, based on the systema idea. They always go up to the point of failure. They find where that is, but they never stay there. They never do 20,000 repetitions of something that you can't handle, that you're imprinting fear or pain or anything. The moment they hit the place where you can't handle it, they back off, dial it down, and then do a lot of repetitions at that place that's just below that where you are handling it. And then they up the game again. So the point is to do lots and lots of repetitions where you're succeeding and get very few repetitions where you fail. You do not want to be practicing failure. That makes no sense as a teaching methodology.
And so this might be a good time to kind of segue into the next discussion topic, which is skill transmission within the art, or problems with skill transmission that's happening within the art. So can you share your perspective on this a little bit? Because you've obviously had decades and decades of training experience and seeing people develop over the years in Aikido.
Yeah, I've trained with many of the top people in Aikido. Most of the senior Americans, the most senior Americans that I have been on the mat with, most of them. And certainly the Japanese teachers who came over here, and I had quite a bit of exposure. Obviously, Saotome Sensei is my teacher, so I've been training with him for 40 plus years. But I had quite a bit of exposure with Chiba Sensei, who was very kind to me and gave me a lot of very good support early on, sort of my mid-career and early in my teaching when I had a dojo. So my observation, and I think this is going to maybe be a little controversial for people, but I think we need to ask ourselves, my generation, which is the first generation to start doing, the Americans, the first generation to start doing Aikido, we're all, say 65 to 75 or maybe 80 for the oldest of us. And, we're starting to pass away or get to the point where we have to retire physically. And certainly the Japanese Shihan who came over have been passing away. Every year we lose somebody. And, there are fewer and fewer left who trained either directly with the founder or directly with one of the teachers who did train directly with the founder. There are just fewer and fewer people. And you have to ask yourself, who's coming along behind my generation that's going to be capable of stepping into our shoes? And I think if people are really honest and they look around and they see the people who have been the main figures in Aikido, in the Aikido transmission in America, and I would say this applies generally elsewhere, but we'll talk about the United States. If you look around and you're just really objective about it, there are very, very, very few people, teachers, who have managed to train anybody who is going to come up to their level, who is going to be capable of really stepping into their shoes technically, as a teacher. I think it's a problem because all of the Uchideshi uniformly, and I've talked to any number of them over the years about their experience with training with O-sensei, and universally, 100% of them say they only got a portion of what O-sensei could do. They everybody got a piece of it, but they uniformly agree that none of them really measured up to him, and that's okay because typically in an art you have the genius founder, and he's the genius founder because he was special, and so yeah, O-sensei stood out. It's the art does not require that everybody get up to that level. Collectively, the teachers probably understood quite a bit of what O-sensei understood, and if you could get out and train with a lot of different people, you might be able to get a decent picture about what the founder did. But we run into problems when we start saying, okay, there was this diminution of skills from the O-sensei's founding to the next generation of teachers who are the ones that spread Aikido all over the world. And, we went from a handful of people training directly with O-sensei to 1 million people training in Aikido worldwide in my lifetime. That's kind of a rapid transmission. And I think that, basically a lot of people ended up teaching who really hadn't really hit the high level of skill that was required to transmit the art at a high level. It spread very fast. So if you look at our situation now, how many of our main teachers, if you look around and you say the 6th and 7th dans who have been around since the 60s and 70s, how many of them have produced one or more students who are going to be as good as they are? And if you have to say, and I believe this, if you have to say honestly that you don't see it, then we have a problem, because the art cannot have that happen 2-3 generations in a row before it just becomes mush. And you can already see that. There's a lot of Aikido out there that people are having a good time. It's a nice movement practice, but it is not very deep spiritually, and it is certainly not effective martially. You're not doing a very good job getting deeply into anything. And, people have been able to do sort of what I think of as mediocre Aikido, but do it for many decades. And because the ranking system, the testing system really didn't necessarily measure what I think it should measure, they could float up to very high ranks and yet not really be able to do anything. And that's just a terrible problem for the art. This is an potentially amazing art. And, we have a bad reputation among other martial arts. They laugh at Aikido a lot. And it's because most of people who are looking at Aikido from the outside, have really not seen what really good Aikido looks like. And, certainly O Sensei was an example of, he didn't care who he walked through the door, whether the guy was a master swordsman or a judoka or a sumo man. He didn't care. His stuff worked. And Saotome Sensei, my teacher, in his younger days, he was very much the same. I have a very good friend, Dan Misiska Sensei, who's been doing Aikido now for many, many decades and is very high ranked in our organization. And I talked to him about how he started Aikido. He had been a very hardcore Tang Soo Do practitioner and probably one of the best Tang Soo Do practitioners in the United States in his youth. And he went to visit Hombu Dojo in Japan, and he got in Saotome Sensei's class. And Saotome Sensei spotted the fact that he didn't look like a beginner and came over and asked him what he did. And Dan replied that he did, karate. And Sensei loved getting his hands on people with real experience like that. So Sensei ended up asking Dan to attack him and just attack. And Dan said initially he did the, polite, you're a guest in somebody else's place, attack. And Sensei said, no, attack me, really attack. And Dan told me that he ended up going after Sensei with everything he had, and he couldn't touch him. That Sensei simply handled his best effortlessly. And that was after that, Dan switched to Aikido, and he's been doing Aikido ever since because of that experience. And how many people are around who say they can do that? How many Aikido teachers can honestly say that if their equivalent in some other art walked through the door, they could handle it respectably? I'm not saying that, some third dan in Aikido can handle a sixth dan in karate. That's a ridiculous mismatch of skills. But if somebody with an equivalent, if you got a 15-year Aikido student and a 15-year student of karate, most places that 15-year student of Aikido would just get beaten up. That's, fighting is not the point of Aikido. O Sensei clearly changed the training that he had done before, which was more combat oriented, and created this art. And I think it's good for us to look at why he changed it, what he intended. So I don't look at this as a fighting art. If you want it to be for fighting, if you need to make it a real martial art, you're going to have to change the form a bit. But the principle should be operating no matter what. So if you're training, to my mind, if you're training properly in Aikido, while applied martial arts is not necessarily the point of the training, it's not the end goal that O Sensei had in mind for the training, that clearly he looked at this as an art for personal transformation, and that was more important than anything else. But if you are training properly, some level of self-defense skill, some level of applicability should be a byproduct of proper training. And then if you really wanted to run in that direction, you would have to pursue a little different kind of training than we typically do. But what I have found in my law enforcement stuff and in the cross training that I did in a number of different arts, the principles that I was taught by Saotome Sensei in my training are applicable any place. You just have to kind of train a little bit differently in the form to make it apply to people who are not on the same, basic form that you're doing. Karate people do things differently. Wing Chun people do things differently. But the Aiki principles can be applied in any situation. You just have to decide you want to practice. So when you get to a certain point in your training, cross-train with people and learn what they do. And if you are interested in that, then find ways to train it. And, I did that with the law enforcement. I had some cops who wanted me to give them, street applicable training. And what I found was I had absolutely no problem at all taking what I'd been taught in my Aikido and finding a way to apply it practically for guys out on the street. And, the guys who were training with me, pretty much the original guys that trained with me were all working in a sort of rough neighborhood in Seattle. And pretty typically anything that we practiced, they had a chance within a week or so to actually try it on somebody. And found that I had no problem applying the principles. So, this is one of those things where if the principles are being taught properly, the principles are universal. The form is specific. So Aikido has a certain form, and I think that form's important. We don't want to devolve the art or change it into something different or lose what makes Aikido special. And Aikido movement is special. Nobody else has that. The Daitoryu people do not move like we do. There is a reason O-sensei created it. I think O-sensei felt, even on a spiritual, energetic standpoint, that the movements of Aikido were the movements of the universe, and there is something transformative about doing the movement. So, in an effort to get to things that are more applicable, and you start seeing this when, people start talking about, mixed martial arts. Gosh, how can Aikido people handle mixed martial artists? And all of a sudden you start losing what makes Aikido Aikido, and eventually if you get up to a certain level of skill in Aiki, it'll apply. You can do this against people who have mixed martial arts skills, but you don't want to be trying to do that too early in your career, or you'll just mess up your Aikido training.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So if skill transmission is an issue, if it truly is the case that, the last couple of generations that we've been losing this foundational skill, what are your thoughts on how we can kind of change that or turn that around? Because I think if this is the case, then like you said, we are in trouble if we continue many more generations of kind of losing skill, right?
Right. My thinking about that is there's a couple elements. One, for the most part, styles of Aikido, slavish imitation of a particular teacher, all of that runs counter to what we need to be doing. Every major teacher, whether it's Saito Sensei or Saotome Sensei or Chiba Sensei, every major teacher that has come before us, as I said, understood a portion, some aspect of what O-sensei was doing. And what we really need to be doing is sharing those skills. So I think there should be a lot more instructor training. In our country, we don't have a Hombu dojo that has an Uchideshi program. If you go to Japan, they train professional instructors. And in the old days at Hombu dojo, that meant that you trained with a really, really wide variety of people who had drastically different takes on things. And so the kind of exposure that Saotome Sensei had to different styles of Aikido, different approaches, and even cross-training in other arts that O-sensei encouraged the deshi to do, whether it was sword training or other martial arts. That kind of exposure led to people with a very broad view of what martial arts are about. And when they applied their Aikido, they incorporated a lot of that stuff. Now, I would say Hombu's different now. They have they're more of a vocational school for training teachers to teach a particular curriculum. So I don't think you can have that same experience anymore. But I think that if we're really trying to pass on to the next generation the best possible version of Aikido, that really involves, one, getting high level targeted instruction together. And I think that Aikido Journal actually has a real role to play in this. You guys could be holding seminars that were geared for, fourth, fifth, sixth Dan people, seventh Dan people, and getting some of the very best teachers out there to teach together, so that you get two or three really high level teachers doing instructor level training, and by sharing the different skills and takes on things that people have, people can really benefit. This whole thing of, I do, whether it's a Wamaryu or some other, style, that's what we do. We don't do anything else. And in fact, you don't even want to see anything else. That's destructive. You're never going to get 100% of what your teacher was giving you. And so if you just stick with that, every generation it's less. You have to get out. Saotome Sensei has always encouraged us to train, both cross-train in other martial arts and to train with other Aikido teachers. I could go to any seminar with anybody, even some teacher that maybe Saotome Sensei personally didn't get along with. And I could go off to a seminar and come back and say, I went to see so-and-so, and he'd say, well, what did you think? And then we'd talk about it and what I thought the strong points were and what I thought were the weak points. And he was completely secure in the idea that, you weren't going to go off and see somebody else and go off the farm and leave him. He had confidence in the value of his own training, but he also really always embodied the idea that more information is good, that there's no limit to how much information you should have. It's going to make you better. And so, all the senseis, the vast majority of sensei's top students have trained in other things and with his encouragement. So I think that that's an important thing. And I think that we can continue that as senior teachers, we should be getting together with each other and co-teaching, and there, you look at the bridge seminars that Ikeda Sensei has been setting up around the country and inviting people from different organizations to co-teach. And I think that's the start of the right concept. What we need to do is take that and say, okay, instead of just having a feel-good seminar where a bunch of people come from different groups and train together and have a good time, let's make this targeted training. Let's say this is instructor level training. We're going to allow you to come if you are, fourth, fifth, sixth Dan, and we're going to try and impart specific skills, but still have that, multi-organization or cross-style approach to it. I think that's the way to make everybody better. There's Iwama-ryu people that I train with, and I know things that could help them do their Iwama-ryu stuff better, but they don't necessarily want to know because I'm not an Iwama-ryu guy. And I'm certain, have, the high level Iwama-ryu people have a handle on some of especially the Kihon Wasa. I mean, Saito was so good at a systematic teaching methodology for certain things. And Saotome Sensei really didn't put a lot of emphasis on the detail of the basic techniques. He figured if you were sincere and training properly, you'd recognize that you had problems and you'd fix it on your own. So he did not do that kind of detailed training. And so, when I trained with the Wama-ryu people or Chiba Sensei was also the same way, a very organized teacher, I always came away learning a ton because they had a different emphasis in their training. If we could share that, we have some hope of really taking this into another generation. I think that the focus in Aikido really has to be not on trying to increase the numbers or get lots of people. I mean, yeah, we all have to have dojos that have enough students that pay the rent, but the emphasis really has to be in this generation on creating some competent instructors for the next generation. And by competent, I mean technically competent, not people who have the organizational skills to keep the organization going. I don't think that actually requires very high level skills. I was on the board of my organization, the Aikido Schools of Ueshiba, and stayed with it for a couple of years when Saotome Sensei first handed things off to us. But I have since resigned from the board because I really wanted to focus on what I do best, which is teaching. And I think there are plenty of people who could do at least as good a job, if not a better job, as a board member, as someone looking out for the organization as a whole. I think there's plenty of people around who could do what I was doing. But I think that there are not very many people who do what I do. So I'm just trying to spend my time really focused on what I do best. And if we could look around and find a group of people like that, get them together and really get that synergistic effect of where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that's I think where the art could revitalize itself.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And Aikido Journal is actually prototyping up an instructor seminar. We're doing one with Bruce Bookman Sensei in May. And we limited it to 18 participants. And almost everybody is 4th, 5th, and 6th Dan. And they're going to come in, and Bruce is going to show his thinking around, what he's been doing in terms of understanding how to interact with grapplers and strikers, people that have some boxing experience. So it should be very interesting to kind of see how that goes. And I hope we can learn from that and get to a point where we'll be able to, get feedback, refine it, and maybe scale it out a little bit, that concept.
See, and I think that is the beginning of what I'm talking about is getting people from different groups, forget the styles, get them up there with somebody who's really top level. And Bookman Sensei, I have massive respect for him as a teacher. When I first came out to Seattle, I trained half-time at his dojo and half-time with Mary Heine Sensei because they each had different approaches, and each one gave me a chance to practice some of what Saotome Sensei did. Mary Sensei didn't typically do weapons. Bruce did a lot of weapons. So I was able to kind of craft the experience that I wanted for myself after I left Saotome Sensei in DC for my job, and was able to do that. And so, I've known Bruce since he first came back from Japan, and he and I have different focuses on what we're doing, but at what he does, he's as good as anybody out there. And I think, and as a guy who could apply his stuff in a martial sense, Bruce is like, if I thought I really had to get into it with somebody, Bruce is one of the 5 people I'd like next to me. He's absolutely fantastic. And as a teacher, he's amazing. And as a human being, I think he's stellar. So I think what I'm talking about is doing that, but starting to have kind of a multi-teacher approach to it where you get 2 or 3 people together at that level and have them bouncing off each other, which is, kind of what some of the bridge seminars have started to do. But those bridge seminars, because they had to, pay the bills and pay the expenses of all these different senseis and stuff, they typically had to have tons of people on the mat, which means you're not able to target the level. And I think that doing that kind of thing, having a 2 or 3 instructor seminar and then doing what you're doing is, let's get some really high level people out here who are ready to train at the level where they can absorb some of what these teachers want to do. Because, I travel all over to teach, but, typically 90% of the people on the mat are not at the level where the things that I would really like to be teaching, they don't have enough of a foundation for me to be able to do it. I have to start with stuff that's much more, kind of down and so I don't get to, and I see the same thing with Saotome Sensei. He teaches seminars, and we are all encouraged to go, and we put a lot of people on the mat, and we have a great training experience. But 95% of the people on the mat are simply not at the level where he can teach what he really wants to teach. And I very often watch him. He'll start trying to teach something, and he'll look around, and the next thing you know, he's had to take it down a couple notches in terms of sophistication, that's a difficult situation, because there are people on the mat who really want to do that and are ready for it. And I take my model that I'm looking for is actually music. My wife was a professional musician, back in the day. She was a folkie and went on the Holiday Inn circuit, and she was talking to me about how musicians train. And if you want to train with somebody at Saotome Sensei's level in the music world, you don't do that as a beginner. You don't train with those people. Those people run master classes, and you have to be accepted to go into those master classes. And the junior people actually pay to watch those master classes. They don't go to the master class, but they watch it. I think there's real room for this in Aikido, where we have some really, really high level training. We put some really people on the mat who are capable of absorbing what the teacher is going to put out. And if other people want to come and observe and learn from that, that's great. But the teacher is able to really communicate with students who are ready to absorb that. Because the way we train in these large groups with all these different levels, and obviously in the pyramid, you have way more people who are down there at the Q ranks or the Shodans or Nidans than there are fifth and sixth dans. And pretty soon, those fifth, sixth, even seventh dans like me, we go to seminars and we're not able to get training that's at our level, because the teacher has to train, sort of teach to the average in the group, or maybe above the average in the group. But if he teaches it, like if I go to a class and their sensei is doing something at my level, most of the people are so left behind that he has to change what he's doing. And I think that to really get the transmission back on track, we need some training consistently offered every year that people can go to that changes that. And I know that Stan really wanted the Aiki Expo to be something like that. And the problem is that there just aren't the large numbers of people who are so serious about their training that they would go to that every year. And it was hard for him economically to do it. He spent an entire year organizing the event, and then basically lost money on it and didn't get back to break even till he sold some videos. That's not a sustainable model. But I think on a smaller scale, 2-3 instructors, sharing, bringing people together in smaller groups. The whole idea of 18 people training with Bookman Sensei, 18 to 20 people is the number that I try and use when I'm doing my intensives, my 4-day intensives. And you can really connect with people doing that.
Yes. And you have one of those coming up soon as well. Isn't that right?
Yeah. I have Memorial Day weekend. I have a 4-day sword intensive. The basics of the sword, the basic forms we use are Saotome Sensei's, but the principles that I'm teaching are universal. So there really isn't anything that Sensei's doing in his sword work that you don't see in just about any sword work, Aikido sword work that you'll see. So it's open to anybody from any style. The only requirement is that you have some decent basics with the sword. I don't want to be showing you how to hold the sword in this thing. I really want to be able to impart some higher level skills. So for 4 days, it's 6-7 hours a day, every day for 4 days. For most people, it's about the most intense training that they've ever done. And I guarantee anybody who shows up that they will leave on Monday night different than they came in Friday. I guarantee it. And that really doesn't matter what level you're at. If you're more advanced, I can up the game, and you'll still walk away feeling like you got something. If you're not high enough level, you're going to feel lost. So, I usually tell people, think of it as first kyu and up, and preferably for me, what I really like trying to reach out to people who are already teaching. If I can get hold of somebody who's teaching weapons at his dojo or is a dojo cho, I do a lot. I'm doing a lot more good. If you show something to somebody who's teaching, you're helping 30 people, not just one. So it's, for me, I encourage instructor level people to come because I try and gear it that way. But I wouldn't tell somebody who's trying to get ready for a Shodan test. This is actually a number of people have used my intensives, my Randori intensive and my weapons intensives. They've used them as a way to kind of try and peak just before they test. And so, if somebody's testing this year for, Dan ranks, this isn't a bad way to kind of really up their game and go into those tests feeling a lot more confident. But, I adjust too based on who comes. If I've got people who are testing in the ASU, I focus a little more on the, actual forms they have to do. If I get people who are from other organizations and are just there to up their skills, I put less emphasis on the details of those forms and more on universally applied principles, how to use your intent and, all of that sort of thing. So, it's a unique training. I don't know anybody else who does one like this. And over the years, a lot of people have come and many people have come multiple times because you don't max out on what you can get out of it just on one attendance. So,
well, sounds fantastic. And for anybody that wants to learn more about your sword intensive or your dojo, where can they go?
The website's the best place. It's the URL is aikieast.com. So AIKI East, like the direction, aikieast.com. And the schedule is there and all the information. I also have a Facebook page that stuff is typically on. There's a dojo Facebook page, Aikido East Side. So you can have my personal page or my dojo page. I actually have a page, Randori Intensives, Randori and Weapons Intensives. I have a lot of Facebook pages. And so the information is readily available.
Fantastic. Well, Sensei, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us in the Aikido Journal community today.
Absolutely. I hope we can do it again.
I hope so too. Thanks again, Sensei.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Aikido Journal podcast. If you find our work valuable, there are many ways you can support it. You can share it on social media, join the discussion on our blog, or you can support us directly by subscribing to Aikido Journal TV, a membership that gives you on-demand access to our video library, new digital gift boxes each month, and other perks. Then there's the Aikido Journal Academy, which produces special events and online courses. All these things and more you'll find on our website at aikidojournal.com. And again, thank you for your support. It's an honor to serve the Aikido community.